recording in progress.
So anyway, today we're going to talk about two passages. Yeah, we could either mute if you'd like to do that, or just know that anything you say is heard. So we're going to talk about actually three books in two chapters of the book, The New Jewish Canon, and shifting a little bit. We've been focusing a lot on Jewish peoplehood, on Holocaust. Last time the Palestinians and Israelis, and those are all very important elements of what has been what defines the last half century in Jewish thought. And we've talked about issues. We talked about feminism, a little bit about LGBT. We could do more, and intermarriage. Now, and we did a little theology too. I sound like Larry David. And we did a little theology too. It's a good commercial in the Super Bowl. But now we're talk a little more about Judaism and about theology, and specifically, why be Jewish? Now, that was never an issue up until very recently. If you think about Jewish history, why be Jewish? Because that's what you are. Because your mother was Jewish, whatever, halachically, but also it's because there was no chance to change one's identity for so long. Only in the more recent periods, the Enlightenment and then Emancipation, we were able to define who we are by autonomy, by personal choice. That's now, at this point, is absolutely how one defines what one is in terms of ethnicity, in terms of religion. It's all personal choice, and that's a major change. That didn't occur in the last 50 years. That occurred before then, but especially has come to the fore in the last half century. So, and Eugene Borowitz, whose book is covered in one of these chapters, talks a lot about autonomy. And it's actually, they all do. When you think about it, when you answer the question, what are you? Who are you? What do you follow? It's always personal choice. Even for the ultra-Orthodox, who may be born into it and feel that they are commanded by God to be doing what they're doing, ultimately in this world, it is still their choice to continue to do that. If you've seen the show, the series Shtisel, you can see that. Although they, for the most part in that show, they opt to stay in, they're still opting. And that's a key point that we've reached. So it doesn't differentiate between orthodoxy and liberal forms of Judaism, progressive forms of Judaism. It's all about choices. Now, once you get to the point where you can make choices, the choices might involve what's behind me, being Jewish or opting to some kind of Eastern religion. As these were photos I took in Kathmandu, in a great Buddhist center there. And I don't know a lot about Buddhism. I've studied a little from time to time. I learned a lot more about Hinduism in college. But I just found this fascinating. And of course, many Jews have gone into Buddhism. In fact, they have a name for them, Jew-boos. The book, The Jew and the Lotus, by Roger Kamenetz, talks a lot about people who are Jewish, who end up taking on Eastern practices, Buddhist practices. And we'll get into that, because these are all choices that people are making. And you wonder. And so there are questions that come up. Why be Jewish? On the one hand, why do so many choose not to remain Jewish, or choose to be Jewish, but only in an ethnic peoplehood kind of sense, but have no real inner depth, spirituality to their Jewish definition, to their Jewishness? On the other hand, we have in this book by Kamenetz, where they go visit the Dalai Lama, who is all agog about Jews, who loves the Jewish people because we have a secret. We have a secret that he needs. And for those who've read the book or read the chapter, you know what that secret is. We've survived. And not only that, but we've survived in exile. And we've thrived in exile. And guess where the Dalai Lama is? In exile, dealing with, of course, the Chinese expulsion from Tibet. So he's now located, of course, in northern India. And that's where a group of rabbis and other Jewish leaders came to see him in 1990. So I'm going to do a little more, I'm going to rely a little more on video than I often do, because I want to give you a sense of what's going on here. Optimize for video clip. So here's the introduction to the book that was shown at a retrospective a little while back.
In the fall of 1990, a group of rabbis traveled to northern India to meet with the Dalai Lama, the leader of Tibet. The Dalai Lama was forced out of his own land in 1959. Later, he turned to the Jewish people for help. "Tell me your secret," he said, "the secret of spiritual survival in exile." Why was I there? I don't know. I wasn't a spiritual person. I wasn't a rabbi or a Jewish scholar even. I was a writer. I was invited to India by my best friend, Mark Lieberman, who organized the whole trip. I went along as a scribe. It's a journey that, in many ways, I'm still on.
Okay, so let me just ask again. So how many have read this book or have heard about it? It didn't seem like too many of you had. Anyone? Okay, so this is a book worth reading. A lot of books that we're going to talk about in the course of this course, as that we've talked about already. Maybe not, but in fact, there are a few that aren't in the book of the New Jewish Canon that I'm thinking of adding in as we go through. I think things that really should have been here aren't, like, let's say, World of Our Fathers by Irving Howe, Jewish Catalog. Anyway, but we've talked a little about the Jewish Catalog. This is a book that's worth reading, and I believe it has several printings. It was a bestseller in terms of the Jewish world, at least. And it's worth reading because it's great to look at the Jewish world, Jewish leadership, Jewish theology, Jewish thought from the perspective of an outsider, which Roger Kamenetz is, somewhat of an outsider, but also a writer, really good writer. And I'll show you some examples of that. But also the people that he's talking about. There's no more fascinating person in the world probably than the Dalai Lama. And in the Jewish world, these are major leaders. We've talked about Yitz Greenberg a lot, and he was on this trip. And he sort of held up the modern Orthodox end. And Zalman Schachter Shlomi, who is the guru, maybe literally, of modern Jewish renewal, neo-Hasidism, held up the sort of Hasidic end. And we'll see that they talk to each other and talk to the Dalai Lama about their visions of Judaism. So this is it's a fascinating book. It's very readable. It's really a great book. I think I'm gonna actually I'll read a little bit from it just to give you a taste. So this trip was to India, to Dharamsala in the north, and of course they had to drive to go the last day of travel, probably, maybe more. And so he describes just their arrival. They're getting there. It's called the National Road of India, Route 1. It has a deceptive ring to an American's ear. I foolishly expected I-95, a nice interstate with a median strip. But for much of the way through Haryana state, 2 lanes carried 4 lanes of traffic. And I've been to India, and I can only imagine this. The main road featured buses, cars, trucks, motorcycles, and motor rickshaws. Large, slow trucks brought sand to construction sites. The sand was wrapped in burlap in huge, sloppy turbines that bulged into the oncoming lanes. And the shoulders offered no relief. They were crowded with their own parade, foot traffic, flocks of sheep and goats, huge lumbering ox carts with wooden wheels straight out of the Bhagavad Gita. At one point, we passed a quarter-mile-long Hindu Mardi Gras with celebrants decked in red and gold robes, pulling a traditional temple cart. Inside was a man heavily made up around the eyes who appeared to be in a light trance. He doesn't mention the motorcycles with an entire family on them. I saw a lot of, Tertians, you've been there. You see that everywhere, and occasionally there are helmets. Occasionally, it's just like there are no rules. The direction of traffic was not uniformly observed. Travelers on the shoulders often meandered onto the main road. Our drivers were extraordinarily adept, but as a matter of honor, they occupied the passing lane for as long as possible, then swerved away from the center line, avoiding the impending accident with a daredevil nonchalance. It's customary for observant Jews to recite the Shema on their deathbed. For the first hour on the road, dozens of Shmas escaped the lips of my fellow travelers, my fellow passengers. It was like the joke about the Israeli bus driver and the rabbi who arrived at heaven at the same time. A big fuss is made over the driver while the rabbi is ignored. What gives, the rabbi asked. I was a rabbi. He was just an Egged bus driver. And an angel answers him, how many people did you get to say the Shema? So anyway, that's just how the book begins. Now, actually, the Shema can sort of be done as part of a traveler's prayer too, so it's not necessarily a deathbed prayer. Of course, it's recited all the time, but it's just that imagery of how it's a whole different world, a different perspective, and they're thrust into it, and they're thrust into it in a manner where they have to converse with someone who is seen as a god. So immediately we have this conflict within the Jewish group of, do we treat him as a god? Isn't that idolatry? Or do we treat him as an honored, distinct individual who is one of the great people, great human beings of. What happened was that the Dalai Lama made them all feel so at home that question was brought up theoretically, but it was never really important because they just hit it off. So one question I want to bring up before I go any farther is the whole question of interfaith relations. Now, most of us, have been around the block a few times. And one of the things we're trying to do is assess how things are different from 50 years ago in terms of Jews and non-Jews in dialogue. How important would you say interfaith relations were, in the 50s, 60s, as opposed to how they are now? Have there been changes, or is it the same? Has it intensified? Is its importance more or less? And how the dialogue goes on. So what do you think when you think interfaith dialogue, interfaith relations, where do you think it stands now as opposed to back then? Sandy?
Well, I don't think it's so much a case of back then. We are, as a synagogue, involved in the dialogue with the African American community, and really reaching out, trying to get a better understanding of where they came from, where they are, and hopefully, though I'm not 100% sure, how much they have asked about where we came from and where we are now. But if you go back to the 60s, there was a great intense relationship to be supporters of the civil rights movement, hence dialogue with African Americans. And somewhere around the 80s, it began to fray and somewhat fall apart. And I think it's the last decade, maybe even the last 5 to 7 years, that there's been a greater push to reestablish that dialogue. Now, our synagogue is involved with refugees who come from all different walks of life. But that, I think, for us is somewhat newer, the Syrians, the Afghans, and the whatever. You take a look at the Council of Synagogues and Churches wanting to know more about the different religions. But I think that the biggest emphasis now is on the race relations between whites and blacks.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Judy, go ahead.
Thinking of it from my vantage point, when in the 50s, 60s, 70s, I always belonged to a synagogue, but our conversations were not about interfaith relations. That was not important. If it was important, it went right over my head. It was not until the more recent decades that I began to feel as though my Jewish world was meeting with the non-Jewish world that I really knew very little about, because I remember when I went to college, it was the first time that I was in classes where, as a Jew, I was in the minority. And I was kind of surprised.
Yeah.
Most people in my school were non-Jews. And I don't think that you'd find that today as prevalent.
So thanks. I mean, one thing that I find interesting is that back then, and it actually predates me to an extent.
Right. I'm from the generation before you.
Well, no, I'm also thinking of something else. Clergy would always have dialogue in America, because that was part of the American way. Protestant, Catholic, Jew. There wasn't so much Muslim dialogue at that point. Buddhist, Hindu, not as much, although in the 60s that certainly came into play for the counterculture. But the congregation wouldn't necessarily see a lot of it. I mean, they'd have the occasional guest speaker. Martin Luther King came to speak in my synagogue when I was growing up. But you wouldn't have exchanges of pulpits between rabbis, ministers, and priests. Rabbis, ministers, and priests would talk to each other. That's why they always walk into a bar. They just always talking to each other. But now, and the conversation would revolve around, this is what Judaism says, this is what Catholicism says, this is what Protestant, actually, this is what Christianity says, and it would be this dialogue of sort of absolutes, very different religions. I think now what you have is almost out of necessity, a need to understand yourself by understanding the other, because the lines are much more blurred. There's an awful lot of similarity, and there always has been, but now not only is there similarity between the theologies and the sort of the abstract notion of what is Judaism, what is Christianity, but also Jews and Christians. We've talked a lot about interfaith families. There's a blending, and that blending doesn't just occur as people of different religions are in the same family, but also the religions themselves begin to blend. And especially it's noticeable for us when dealing with Eastern religions, because we've seen it so much because of the counterculture, where so many Jews have been attracted to Eastern religions. And so this particular encounter was Dalai Lama trying to find out what is the Jewish secret to survival. But the real secret of the book is the Jews are trying to find out the secret to their own survival by finding how Judaism is really not that different from the things that Jews are so attracted to about the Dalai Lama and about Buddhism in particular, but about Eastern religions in general. It is a fascinating dynamic. So you see this sort of, not a debate, but you see this contrast between Yitz Greenberg and Zalman, talking about Judaism, but Zalman ends up becoming the prime spokesman. Why? Because he's into Kabbalah. He's the Chassid. He's all into Kabbalah, and the Dalai Lama eats it up. He loves it.
It's a message.
And so because of that, he becomes sort of the representation of Judaism, when Kabbalah is fascinating, but it is not in any way a mainstream, or at least traditionally mainstream, view of God and of Jewish life. It's become more and more mainstream, I think, because of the influence of Eastern religions. So just fascinating. So anyway, I want to show you another video. See if I can do this. Hold on. First of all, this is the Dalai Lama dealing with negative emotions. I want you to, it is attractive. I heard him speak once at Brown. It was incredibly compelling. He's just such a nice guy, and his English is pretty good. So let's see this one.
If I may ask, what do you do when you have some negative thoughts in your head? What is the simplest thing one can do to rid oneself of those negative thoughts, overthinking and negative?
Can you all hear?
Negative emotion, you see, mainly related with two things. One, self-centered attitude. I, my, like that. See, that. Then another sort of factor is we accept the reality as appears. The shunyata, anatma theory, and the shunyata theory, nothing exists as appears. So since all negative emotion very much based on appearances, so once you realize nothing exists as appears, the wisdom side, Parija side, Upaya side, altruism, so the antidote of self-centered attitude. So self-centeredness is one factor. And then believe or grasp things as appears. These two things are the basis of negative destructive emotion.
Makes sense. So could a rabbi have said the same thing? There's no one right answer to this, by the way. Rabbi couldn't have said exactly the same thing using the words, the terminology. But in essence, it's love your neighbor as yourself. It's although the love your neighbor as yourself does inject a bit of the self. There is a bit of I-ness to it, because you have to love yourself. The phone always rings every time, doesn't it? It's usually my son. Anyway, it's that sense of I-ness is still there, and loving yourself, but loving your neighbor, it's altruism. It's taking the I out of it. And you can find within Judaism that, especially within Hasidism, that sense of negating the self. And certainly altruism, has its place there. Now, the other side of it, that the whole world is an illusion, that's a little more complicated. But you can find within Kabbalah certainly a belief that all is one, that there are different levels of reality. The material reality is the lowest level, and there's a much higher spiritual level of reality. And Zalman talks about that with charts and the whole works in his lectures that he gives to the Dalai Lama. So you could basically say that a rabbi could teach the same thing, but you got the Dalai Lama. He's superhuman. He's a hero. It's hard to compete with that. So I want to play you another video. This is one of the participants in this trek. He's not a rabbi, he's a professor and this is years later. He's talking about it, and a couple of incidents having to do with angels, which gets to this point of how Jews and Buddhists can talk on the same level, same language. But also there's a story about the Ram Das at the end that's devastating, but also incredible. Let's see. I'm going to get to that. This is working out so far. All right, here we go. Whoops. So far, so good. Okay.
You've probably heard about dialogue in 1990 with the Dalai Lama and 8 Jewish philosophers, scholars, rabbis, whatnot. And I was asked to be part of that 8-person delegation. There's that book by Roger Canon, The Jew and the Lotus. It's a good book, And here we all are with the Dalai Lama toward the end of our meeting. As I mentioned before, the Dalai Lama wanted to learn the Jewish secret for how to preserve religion and culture while in exile. A familiar Strimel or something to you. One of the members of the delegation was my good friend, Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi. It's very important in this because to talk to a Tibetan mystic, as the Dalai Lama is, as a Jew, you'd better be a Jewish mystic, unless you're talking about something else, right? So Zalman, very enthusiastic fellow, brings charts. He 4 levels of creation, the Sphirot, and he's drawing all these diagrams and talking this and that. And the Dalai Lama is just rapt attention, looking at him. And once in a while, he turned to some other lamas around him. Oh, what do we say about that? And we discussed a little bit. It was really amazing. And one time, Zalman talks about angels. There is in Kabbalah an important angelology. This got the Dalai Lama even more enthusiastic. And the Dalai Lama said, now tell me about that angel. What color is that angel? How many arms and how many legs? What does he hold in each hand? Does he have wings? And like this, and back and forth and back and forth. Is there an angel? Everyone is a guardian angel. Yes, we believe that too. Dalai Lama says, do you believe that each nation has a guardian angel or deity? Yes, we certainly do that. We certainly believe that we are protected by Hashem. And so they're going back and forth. And Zalman says to the Dalai Lama, Your Holiness, if I do my job well and you do your job well, Chenrezig is speaking through you, and our tradition is speaking through me. Our angel, our God, is speaking through me. Now, he's talking about all these angels, and everybody else in the room, the Jews, is sort of scratching their heads. Now, we've heard there's angelology in Kabbalah, but it was never something alive, or frankly, to me, particularly meaningful, though of course it is to others. But here, that was one of the most important bridges that the Jewish group could make with the Dalai Lama. This is at that event in 1990. Oh, so one thing we did, one of the members of the delegation was a professor at Hebrew University, now at Chicago, called Paul Mendes-Floor. So Paul brought with him a replica Sefer Torah, which he gave to the Dalai Lama, not proper parchment, but in a nice case, and that still sits in his prized bookcase right behind his throne where he teaches is a Torah. He also brought a formal invitation from the government of Israel to the Dalai Lama to visit, and he's been there a number of times. And he brought some seeds from Jaffa oranges. Now, we were all put up by the Dalai Lama at his sister-in-law's house, known as Kashmir Cottage, and she's known as Rinchen Roma. And she's wonderful, wonderful person. She is the one who does more to help Tibetan women, Tibetan nuns especially, get better education. Absolutely wonderful. And she said, Professor Katz, I've got to show you this. Come outside, go around. She says, you see this orange tree? Little oranges on it. Those are from the seeds Paul brought us. And, you know, all the time that in 1990, what are the seeds we're planting? What fruit is this going to bear? This whole enterprise of dialogue, what's going to come of it? And here's something very, very tangible. So it's the end, and we're staying at our hotel in New Delhi, and there's Zalman, and there's me, and who do you run into in the hotel lobby but Ram Dass? If you know who Ram Dass is, that's him, a Jewish guy, Hindu guru, and was fired from Harvard with Leary for LSD research and all that stuff, but a great character. So we all decided, look, it's just about time for afternoon prayers for Mincha. I knew. Let's go to the Delhi synagogue and we can pray there. They're very nice. Okay, yeah, let's go. So come on, Ram Dass, you come on. Okay. So we go there, and the praying is ethereal. It's just beautiful. We kept doing one and more psalms after psalms and chanting, and it was a beautiful service. And then I suggest let's go out for dinner. I know, it's really strict vegetarian restaurant. You can trust it. Okay. So I went out to dinner. We have a lovely meal of South Indian food. And it just so happens it's a long table, and Ram Dass is right across from me. We're chatting. I'd met him back then briefly. And then it comes time to chant Birkat Hamazon, the grace after meals. So we're chanting. After we're done chanting, Ram Dass leans over. Excuse me. That was a very nice tune you were singing. What was it? That broke my heart. That breaks my heart. Brilliant man. Deep reservoir, a good heart, good spirituality. Growing up Jewish and never heard the grace after meals being chanted. So he became a Hindu.
Okay. For some reason, are you? Whoops, hold on 1 second. There I am. Okay. You can see me, right? I'm back. So what's your reaction to that story? Do we know people like that? I mean,
my reaction.
Yeah, go ahead, Roz.
My reaction isn't surprise, because I feel that there are many young people, let's say young Jewish people, who are brought up without the feeling of, should I say, spiritual Judaism, who are attracted by these other religions, but they really know very little about Judaism, and they're attracted by whether it's the spirituality or whatever of these religions. I mean, that's what he was showing, that he didn't even know the grace after meals, but he could know about,
Which, by the way, I would say probably not a majority of Jews know, but many of whom have a very spiritual connection to Judaism. You don't need to be able to do Birkat Hamazon, grace after meals, after every meal in order to feel spiritually Jewish. But this is a giant of the spirit. And you see so many, especially these Jew-boos, these Jews who became very involved in Buddhist and meditation, not finding it in Judaism. And maybe we needed to shift over to a Zalman mode of Judaism sooner, which, is much more Eastern religion oriented, Kabbalistic. Or maybe we just should have been able to find it in the more mainstream forms of Judaism. But what he got in his synagogue growing up wasn't enough. Jonathan, did you want to say something? Okay. I thought you were going to. Sandy?
I have a question. only because so many people have mentioned the word spirituality, and you read it in every single article that you can find. How would you define the essence of spirituality?
I think it's going beyond, pure sort of definition of who we are as, being Jewish in an ethnic sense, and heading toward a more a deeper pursuit of meaning, focused on supernatural, focused on ultimate truths, focused on God, and focused perhaps on life of the spirit as opposed to the physical life of the body. But I mean, there are lots of ways to define it.
But
So
when you take a look at humanistic Judaism, the humanists don't necessarily believe in God, but they feel that they're very, very spiritual. So doesn't it run the gamut?
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. It's probably a little trite just to throw the word spirituality around as much as is done, and I often do. But in terms of this particular pursuit, in this class, we've differentiated between Jewish peoplehood and, things that define one's Jewishness, like loyalty to Israel or to other Jews, Soviet Jews, Holocaust-related issues, stuff like that, and deeper, more profound pursuits. And these particular books are all about, going beyond that. I'm not saying it's better, because I think there are reasons where Jewish peoplehood is more powerful. Certainly the 6-Day War was an example of that, and maybe it's interchangeable in terms of the spiritual impact of Israel on us, for instance.
My question was not a criticism, but I'm always interested in finding out how things compare and contrast. And so many times, you think of one thing and then you find out something else. But
no, any question is good, and absolutely, you can challenge me too. That's not a bad thing. I know you're not doing that here, but that's okay.
No, definitely not.
No, it's fine. So, just the whole question. I want to get back to the question of what is the Jewish secret, because the Dalai Lama was sort of jealous of that. I mean, he's only been in exile for what? Now it's like 70 years. No, 60 something. But we've been we were, I should say, for 2000. And somehow we're able to survive. And it wasn't on the basis of Kabbalah alone. So that's where Yitz Greenberg comes into the story. And in one of the chapters, he talks a lot about covenant as a key to remembering. I mean, some of the things that you'll hear from Yitz a lot. The memory of the temple was never lost. We just saturate our lives with ritual that help us to remember. Rituals like the Seder. I mean, the Seder is a perfect example. The whole Seder plate is memorializing different things, but especially the temple, the sacrifices that we no longer do. And those holy days were reconfigured, in fact, Yitz Greenberg says, in order to keep history alive. So, for instance, holidays like Shavuot, Passover, did not have historical purposes. They were agricultural holidays originally in biblical times. The rabbis reconfigured them in order that they become keys to remembrance, keys to the portability of Judaism. The Torah itself, a symbol of that portability, being portable. Here's where we sort of overlap from this book to Borowitz and Gilman, and we're back again to people having the choice of whether to be Jewish. Is this powerful enough? It was powerful when we were in exile to cling to the dream of next year in Jerusalem at the Seder. Now we can go to Jerusalem. Now we're no longer in exile. at least in theory, we can get on the next plane, COVID permitting, move to Israel. Incidentally, a little parenthetical thing. I always like to throw in the news. An interesting account in today's news. There's a deal in the works. One of the religious authorities in Israel, of course, the government does not have the ultra-Orthodox parties in it, wants to cut a deal where there will be civil marriage, which has been a long time dream, never had it in Israel, civil marriage. So Jews could marry other Jews, not in an Orthodox setting, as long as it's done in an embassy or consulate of another country, but in Israel. So that's, of course, the other side of it. The thing they want to get passed is the law of return. They want to alter it so that a grandchild of a Jew isn't automatically presumed eligible for Aliyah, automatically Jewish, even if they're not halachically Jewish. Of course, the law of return came in because of the Nuremberg laws, that any Jew should have the chance to move to Israel, even if they only have one Jewish grandparent, because that they would have been susceptible to the Holocaust. They would have been victimized by the Nuremberg laws of the 1930s. So anyway, it's just about Aliyah. Go ahead, Roz.
Yeah, when you just said that Jews for all the time, said next year in Jerusalem at the end of the Seder.
Yeah.
I think the Jews in the diaspora before the United States, many of them have hard suffering, anti-Semitism, whatever. And it was like the dream. Next year in Jerusalem might not even be the actual Jerusalem. It was like next year will be better for the Jews. And I think it's less effective now, not only because you can get on a plane to Israel, but you don't have that feeling of, for a better life or a better Jewish life.
Oh, yeah, I agree. And that's, I think we would take the deal here that we have a state of Israel, but the fulfillment of the dream means we've gotten to the end of that dream. We've got to create a new dream, and otherwise it loses its power and we all end up becoming Buddhists. Maybe not, but I mean, that's sort of what the conclusion is, that as much as we were, and Yitz Greenberg especially, was talking to the Dalai Lama, yes, this is our secret to survival, but you're still in exile. You're going to survive because it's a very potent force that we've discovered. It is our secret in a sense of how to ritualize memory and how to become a portable religion. But now we have to figure out how to do it in our own new way. And, perhaps that new way has a lot more to do with Zalman Schachter's work than it does with Yitz Greenberg's and some of the others that we read about. So anyway, it's fascinating now that, exile is over. So does anyone have any comments about the reading itself? I mean, I'll just look quickly at it. And also sort of comments on the same thing on page 269. I didn't put it up in the chat, but I had sent it out, so hopefully you have it. If you didn't print it out, you have it somewhere. But I'll read it. One thorny issue that arose in the dialogue and related conversations was the question of why there's a disproportionate number of Western Buddhist teachers and practitioners from Jewish backgrounds, including those who identify as Jubu, culturally Jewish but spiritually Buddhist, or simply as Buddhist. The members of the delegation grappled with issues of religious switching and hybridity. Both terms are not yet part of the popular discourse on religion, particularly in a post-Holocaust age in which issues of continuity are especially charged. Importantly, in exploring these issues, the delegates were brave enough to ask whether or not they and other Jewish leaders were offering their constituents compelling reasons to live engaged Jewish lives. Given the excitement about Kabbalah on the trip and its increased popularity in the United States at that time and now, there were lively conversations about making Jewish mystical teachings and practices more accessible, including meditation and visualization. There was also a frank discussion about people's misperceptions about what is real or mainstream Judaism and the universal truth that in every religious tradition, what you invest is what return you get. As Ram Dass himself, the American Hindu teacher, stated at a post-trip event. Finally, the dialogue participants also grappled with the fact that some people, including some Jews, simply find greater fulfillment in a religious tradition other than the one into which they were born, and that others feel comfortable belonging to more than one tradition. So maybe we shouldn't be just beating our chests so much about this. Maybe it's just going to happen that there are a lot of Jews who are also Buddhists. And by the way, it's a lot easier to be a Jew-boo than to be a Jewish Christian or a Jewish Muslim, simply because we're not dealing with two monotheistic religions. We're dealing with very different kinds of religions, and they are complementary, especially if you take on the Jewish part as more of an ethnic identity. Yes, Sandy.
It seems like Judaism has become an a la carte menu, which I happen to think is a good thing, that there are so many ways in which we can differentiate and choose to follow or to take on those characteristics that have meaning for us. And other people just take on different characteristics. But one of the interesting things about Buddhism, I have a couple of yoga teachers who are Jewish, and yet they're very Buddhist in their orientation. And what they say is that the values of Buddhism really are so complementary and similar to Jewish values that it's just a way in which to make your life richer, whether you want to be a Jew-boo or just a Jew who follows some of the teachings or accepts some of the teachings of Buddhism. I think there was a movie, Love, Pray, and Eat, that was
Eat,
about
pray, love. They eat first, then they pray, then they love.
That just about covers
Uh-huh.
so what we believe in.
Well, so, and this is covered in the Neil Gaiman reading. Is it just good enough to be a good person? You know, is that enough? Because you can find in every religion, love your neighbor as yourself. So if we whittle down each religion to its least common denominator, that's what you get. But I think that's not rich enough to sustain itself beyond, just people trying to be good, which isn't the worst thing in the world. But if you feel that there's something valuable and enriching in a Jewish life, you have to get beyond it. So the why be Jewish, it just keeps coming back to that because it still is a choice, and it's less of an ethnic choice for most American Jews these days. So I want to switch over to the other book because they try to answer not so much the why, but the how. And for Neil Gaiman, who in this book really sold well, Sacred Fragments, more than you would expect a book on theology to sell. Part of it is because it's really a textbook. It can be used in adult ed classes. I should mention that Neil Gaiman came to Bethel several times, because he came once as a scholar in residence, maybe twice. And we also had him teach a weekly class at one time where he talked about Jewish theology. That was his thing. He was a teacher of mine. He was the head of the seminary when I entered. He was the one who let me in. A really good teacher. I think he had the same issue that a lot of his generation had. He's the generation after Heschel. You can't follow Heschel, so. And this book really, he's in the sacred Jewish canon, the modern Jewish canon, but he's always going to be seen as Heschel's student. and compared to his teacher, Heschel, Abraham Joshua Heschel. And so I don't think he was ever seen as one of the great giants. Now, same thing with Heschel. When he was at the seminary, he was underrated because then they worshiped the Talmudists like Saul Lieberman. Anyway, that's a little seminary inside dope. But with Gilman, though, I always got the sense that he felt it too, which is too bad because he really was a great teacher, an excellent teacher, and a really good writer. And this book is an example of both of those things: his ability to teach, his ability to write. As a representative of conservative Judaism, he wrote a lot of books about the conservative movement. There aren't a lot of conservative Jewish theologians in captivity. Of course, he passed away several years back. There really aren't a lot. And part of why I don't think he gets the universal awe that Heschel does. Heschel is not necessarily tied into the conservative movement. Heschel's religion is Heschel. Heschel's version of Judaism is very experiential and sort of unique to him. Gilman, on the other hand, is a defender of conservative Judaism, an apologist, one might say, for conservative Judaism. So this is my roundabout way of saying that his answer to the question of how one can sustain being Jewish and find deep meaning in being Jewish is through commitment to Jewish law, to halakha. Mm-hmm. He gives the whole gamut of other options. But remember, I said at the beginning, it's all a choice. We choose to be Jewish. But he also took very seriously that we need to have our own theologies. Now, Jewish law is somewhat objective, although, again, it's our choice. But we have to choose to take it upon ourselves to be obligated to Jewish law, that God is commanding us to keep the Sabbath. We've talked about commandedness before, that it's not, we're choosing for it not to be a choice, in a sense. But theology, how we view God, of course, with Judaism, it's fair game. You can create your own theology, imagine God in many, many different ways. So when he came to Bethel, I don't know, maybe some of you were there, but we used to, when we had Scholar in Residence weekends, we would do a Saturday night social program, often at Norman Milton Mann's house. They had a really big house. It was just a beautiful setting, almost like a sort of the old salons of Europe. And so we would sit at the feet of the master, and we had about 20-25 people at least, maybe more. And it was a whole night dedicated to theology. But instead of him lecturing about theology, he gave us paper and pencil, or we splurged for pens, and said, describe God, your God. What is God to you? And he liberated us to not have to follow, Avinu Malkeinu, Father King, and all the imagery, the metaphors in the Torah, in the Bible, in the prayer book, that all were just inventions of different people over the ages. So it was a wonderful experience. I remember one in particular was Fran Ginsburg. And of course, she spent her entire career delivering babies and occasionally creating them. So she compared her in vitro experiences, not personally being in vitro, but creating life, to how she imagined God. And it was just so incredibly powerful. And everyone came up with something based on their own experiences. So Gilman brought that out in us. That's really what I appreciate him. I don't mean to downgrade him in any sense. He wasn't Heschel because no one was, but really a great professor. So I'm glad that his book, this Sacred Fragments, is listed here in this list of the Jewish canon, that it made it in. And he says, sort of what we were talking about a minute ago, it's not enough to be a good person. And then he talks about Isaiah saying that ethics are very important, but ritual, he talks about ritual being really important too, and particularly the commitment to Jewish law, to halakha, which is what conservative Judaism is based on, although it's somewhat become nebulous. So let me then move quickly to Eugene Borowitz, who was to the Reform movement, I'd say what Gilman was to the conservative, because they actually died, within weeks of each other. It's mentioned in the article here, and these books came out. Their Renewing the Covenant was Borowitz's book, A Theology for the Postmodern Jew, 1991. Gilman's was 1990, Sacred Fragments. So Gilman visited us. Borowitz lived here, and some of you may have met him from time to time. He lived at Edge Hill. He retired to Edge Hill after his teaching days, but he was a legend. I would say he's more equivalent to Heschel in the Reform movement than to Gilman. He was like the giant of his generation. People, and after he passed away, you could read the testimonies of his students, many of whom are famous rabbis themselves, and they would shudder at in his class because he was so revered and so tough. But he started a Bible study class at Temple Sinai as a member of the Reform movement. So he often he would lead classes on Shabbat mornings there, and I got to work with him a lot. I got to work with him because he was on the Harold Hoffman lecture committee, since he lived like 2 doors down from Hyacinth Hoffman at Edge Hill. So we just invited him in, and he helped us come up with great speakers. Anyway, so Borowitz is saying, no, it's not about halakha, because after all, he's a Reform Jew. So he said, and this is in our readings on page 254, I reject the normative principle that authentic Jewish continuity requires the halachic process. Our people did not lack covenant faithfulness in the millennium before the rabbinic period, when its primary religious structure appears to have been priestly and cultic. Of course, before the rabbinic period, during the Bible, the biblical time. This precedent allows for the possibility that the rabbinic structuring of Jewish life that proved so effective until the emancipation may now need to be drastically altered. Positively put, do the radically changed Jewish social status and cultural ethos that resulted from modernization prompt us to devise a more appropriate way of framing Jewish existence? And he answers that question, yes. So he's a champion in many ways, like Yitz Greenberg among the Orthodox and others whom we've read, and even Jew in the Lotus, that the rabbinic era is over. The era of old traditions, adherence to Jewish law, old ways, has been replaced by the authentic self, the sovereign self, as Arnold Eisen calls it, his former JTS chancellor and sociologist. And we can choose whether to be Jewish. So the answer is, the question we have to keep asking is, why be Jewish? We have to answer it again and again and again, but in his mind, by reinventing Judaism for a post-rabbinic era. He calls it postmodern. Gilman's book, Recovering Theology for the Modern Jew, what's the difference between modern and postmodern? Does anyone want to guess? Again, no one right answer. Okay. I know some rabbis, they'll just wait for the answer, but I know it's 8 o'clock. So the postmodern period usually takes into account that the modern era ended once we dealt with the Holocaust and the atom bomb. I mean, the things that happened in the 1940s took us beyond what we thought was modern to a whole different period that we've entered. And Yitz Greenberg talked about it as the third era of Jewish life post-Holocaust. So that's what Borowitz is talking about. But finding new ways to be Jewish. So it all ties together. Go ahead, Roz.
Yeah, Rabbi, I wonder if within each of the Jewish, I don't call them denominations,
Yeah.
There was more information about the other. Because I always used to feel, do you remember years ago when like the Hare Krishna people were in New York and they were begging on the streets and they were wearing those uniforms? And I always used to see them and I knew some of them must be Jewish. And I thought to myself, I wonder if they knew that they can go over the Eastern Parkway and join another cult and still be Jewish, but be maybe more of that mystic and wear a uniform and so forth. But it probably never even dawned on them the possibility because they just came from a Jewish tradition that wasn't fulfilling enough for them.
Yes. I think now, maybe I'm being overly optimistic, but I think now it's so easy to cross those lines that there's no negation of one's Jewishness. Even on the observance level, you can still like love Shabbat, love Hanukkah, and bring this, Buddhist or Hindu element into your observance of Shabbat in a way that you really couldn't before. You see it in the media, you see it in movies, you see like that series Transparent that was on like 5 years ago. Jewish Buddhists in LA, it's like a thing. So maybe we see it more in other places too. But you talked about dialogue, and that's another thing I mentioned at the beginning. It's a good place to sum up. We didn't know, I didn't really know what Hasidism was growing up. And I grew up in a large conservative shul. We had a Rebbe not too far away. In fact, on Simchat Torah, we would go there because they did a good Simchat Torah, had good cake and beverages. So, we didn't really know. There was a Reformed synagogue right down the street. I never went into it. It's like the synagogue you didn't go into. But that's changed. And Eugene Borowitz is one of the reasons for that. He created a journal, what he called a Journal of Jewish Responsibility, that more than any other publication of the last half century, on a monthly basis, I think it was every other week for a while, would bring together different views, would bring together Jewish dialogue within the community, Reform, Orthodox, Reconstructionist, and conservative. And it was called Shema. Some of you may have heard of Shema magazine. It still exists on an online basis. It was connected to the Forward, the Jewish Forward, for a while. But it's SH with an apostrophe MA. So if you Google it, you will find so many issues that deal with Judaism, but from a comparative basis. And it created this dialogue among Jews that I think has sustained well beyond his lifetime. He retired years ago, before he died, obviously, but long before, and Shema continued. So anyway, so I think there's an optimistic way to look at this. We're still here, even though this Buddhist community in Kathmandu behind me is doing pretty well too.
Well, Rabbi?
Yes, go ahead, Jeff.
This may be
you have the last word.
All right. Well, this may be a simplistic approach, but it seems like the Orthodox part of Judaism relies on laws and rituals to a very large extent, and the more Reform side relies on spirituality to a much larger extent, and those of us in the conservative, kind of in the middle, rely on a mixture of the two. And I think those things work for each of those groups, and I don't see any problem with that. So
yeah, so was the next to last word, because I'm going to speak.
I assumed that would be the case.
No, I think that's one way of looking at it, but I think it's a little more complicated, because within Orthodoxy, you certainly have a spiritual side. You have Hasidism. You have the more intellectual, legalistic side that is often contrasted to Hasidism. But now, in this day and age, it's actually combined. You see Hasidic communities that are very strict in their observance, but also very spiritual in terms of the ethical and prayer and all of that. And I think within Reform Judaism, you're seeing a move toward tradition, so a little bit more to the right, and conservative is sort of, I don't think the center is holding very well. So it's got both, as you said. It's 15% of American Jews are a conservative movement now. When I was growing up, it was about 40%. So it's that's what we're up against. The people tend to go to the fringes.
What are the other percentages for Reform? And
Reform was probably in the 30s. The conservative was the largest. Orthodoxy was at about 10. And now, the birth rate would increase that, but it's still only about 15. You have a lot of people who affiliate with Chabad, but who aren't themselves Orthodox. So, but most now, of course, the largest number is the nuns, as we call them, N-O-N-E, not N-U-N, who just don't have a movement and don't want one, don't need one, especially among younger Jews. So we got to give them a reason why be Jewish, and they're, I think, going to find it, or they're seeking it, but not within the old established movements. And that's, of course, one of our huge challenges. We deal with it every board meeting and at every other committee meeting, trying to figure out how to bring people in. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes.
Yes. Hi, Ross.
Hi. Often we're in New York and we go to services in New York when it's not a pandemic. And just what you're saying, bringing in young people. I'm sure you've been to like Ramamu on a Friday night. They're like packing them in. So what are the secrets? Or even at BJ's on a Friday night? Because there's more young people living there who might be interested as well. But
if we had 1 million Jews living in Stamford, I think we do really well. But you have to sort of compare in a different way. Also, you don't need to be a big tent when you have so many synagogues around. So you can really focus in on what you do best. Now, B'nai Jeshurun totally transformed themselves in the 90s, the 80s and 90s. And we had a few congregants from Bethel who were very involved there too. So they brought me down there, and I knew the rabbi. He was at JTS when I was there. And we incorporated a lot of their stuff. I mean, we can't be what they are, but we brought in a lot of the music. And that music now is all over the conservative end. They're not actually conservative. They're non-denominational. Romamu is reconstructionist / renewal. It's really renewal. Again, not part of a movement, but they are definitely the flagship for whatever renewal is. It doesn't really call itself a movement. Very much based on the Zalman Schachter Shlomi model of mysticism, and young people love it. I'm finding that young people don't like to join movements. They just want to be who they are. I don't know. It sounds very old personish just to try to lump them all together, but you got to do it. There are groups in New York, actually nationwide. One called Moishe House, that is a non-denominational, non-Orthodox Chabad, and they're doing a great job of bringing people in. As is Hadar, which does it, in terms of Jewish studies and learning, and Romamu and BJ, but you don't see that as much because of the pandemic. They've sort of had to alter their strategies. They're online, but I think they're back in person now too. So, all right, anyone else? This is a great conversation. It's the conversation. This is the strategic planning that we all need to be doing. This is the strategic planning committee of Bethel, but you don't know it yet. You're our focus group, but this is what, and we do have some board members here. So this is what we should be doing a lot, and we should be doing all the time, and trying to figure out whether we're looking for change in the way that Zalman Schachter Shlomi brought it, or whether we want to find more tradition in the form of Neil Gaiman, and somewhere in the middle is Eugene Borowitz, and you can just chuck it all to the side and enjoy a good book and read The Jew and the Lotus. So that's the way it is tonight. Anyway, good to see all of you, and I think we are meeting next week, I'm pretty sure. So I'm going to have to find a couple of books for us to talk about. Will do, though.
Rabbi.
All right. Thank you all.
Thank
Have a good
you.
night. Take
Good
care.
night.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Stay warm. Stay warm.